The mountains had always called to Melissa Johnson. Despite every dismissive glance and concerned warning, she had prepared meticulously for this moment, her solo trek into the Grand Teton backcountry. With each item carefully packed in her custom-ordered gear, she was determined to experience wilderness on her own terms, regardless of what others thought a 300-pound woman should attempt. Her cousin Brad had reluctantly dropped her at the trailhead, extracting a promise. One night at campsite 3C4, then back by 1 o'clock tomorrow. No exceptions. She had nodded, confidence radiating from her smile as she adjusted her bear bells and disappeared into the dense pine forest, ready to claim her adventure. None of them could have known that even perfect preparation sometimes isn't enough in the wilderness, that bear behavior follows no human guidebook, that sometimes the worst odds find you despite doing everything right. Brad stared at his watch. 4:30 p.m. Melissa was 3.5 hours late. The empty trailhead parking lot seemed to mock his growing dread as shadows lengthened across the mountains where his cousin remained unaccounted for. The afternoon sun filtered through the passenger window, warming Melissa Johnson's arm as the rental car wound its way along the scenic highway. The towering pines of Grand Teton National Park created a rhythmic pattern of light and shadow across the dashboard, hypnotizing in their consistency. At 300 pounds, Melissa shifted uncomfortably in the cramped seat, her thighs pressed against the center console. The discomfort didn't diminish her excitement. After 2 years of planning, saving, and countless hours researching, she was finally here. "Are you sure about this, Mel?" Brad asked for what must have been the 10th time since they'd left Oklahoma 3 days ago. His knuckles whitened slightly around the steering wheel. The rangers made it pretty clear that solo hiking isn't recommended, especially for someone who doesn't look like they belong on a hiking trail, Melissa finished, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made her cousin wince. "Or were you going to say for someone my size?" From the back seat, Tammy leaned forward. "That's not what he meant, and you know it." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Brad's worried about you, we both are. Even experienced hikers go in groups here." Melissa let out a breath, deflating slightly. "I know, I'm sorry, it's just, I've been planning this for so long. I've read every book, studied every map. I have all the recommended gear." She patted the guidebook in her lap, dog-eared and highlighted, with sticky notes protruding from a dozen pages. Pine Ridge Backcountry, a complete guide, had become her Bible over the past year. Brad caught her eye briefly before returning his attention to the winding road. "We know how much this means to you. We're not trying to talk you out of it. We just want to make sure you're being realistic." Realistic. The word hung in the air between them. Melissa had heard it her entire life, usually preceding a list of things she couldn't or shouldn't do because of her weight. Can't ride certain rides. At amusement parks, shouldn't wear certain clothes, won't find someone to love her. Won't ever see 35 if she doesn't get her health under control. But Melissa had turned 35 last December, and she decided that her gift to herself would be this trip. Proof that she could accomplish something remarkable, something that had nothing to do with losing weight or fitting into society's narrow definition of achievement. "The ranger at Riverdale Station was really helpful," Melissa said, changing the subject. "She went through all the safety protocols with me twice. I've got my permit for campsite 3C4, which is about 7 miles in from Aspen Creek Trailhead. She said it's one of the more accessible sites." "Accessible meaning what exactly?" Tammy asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "Meaning the elevation gain is moderate, and the trail is well maintained." Melissa flipped open her guidebook to a marked page. "Look, it's mostly a gentle slope with just one steeper section about 4 miles in. The campsite itself is in a small clearing near Beaver Creek, which means I'll have access to fresh water." Brad nodded, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "And did the ranger mention the bears?" Melissa rolled her eyes. "Only about 100 times. That's what all these are for." She reached into her day pack and pulled out a string of small bells. "Bear bells. They make noise while I walk so I don't surprise any bears on the trail, and I've memorized all the proper food storage techniques. No food in the tent. Hang everything at least 10 feet off the ground and 4 feet from any tree trunk." She didn't mention that the ranger had seemed skeptical of her ability to hoist the food bag high enough, her eyes darting briefly to Melissa's. Arms before suggesting she practiced the technique before heading out. Melissa had practiced in her backyard for weeks before the trip, perfecting her throw until she could consistently get a rope over a branch 15 feet up. "What about bear spray?" Tammy asked. The ranger said it's not widely available yet. Apparently, it's still pretty new technology. Most hikers use the bells and proper food storage as their main precautions. Melissa ran her fingers over the glossy photos in the guidebook, showing pristine alpine meadows and crystal-clear streams. Besides, the ranger said most bears in this area try to avoid humans. As long as I make plenty of noise and don't surprise one, I should be fine. The car rounded a bend and the visitor center came into view, a rustic log structure nestled among towering pines. Brad pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine. I told you we should get a room at the Pine Ridge. Lodge for a couple of nights before and after your hike, he said, reaching into the back seat for his jacket. That way we can all get our bearings, and Tammy and I can familiarize ourselves with the area while you're gone. Melissa nodded, gathering her guidebook and the stack of park brochures she'd collected since their arrival. As they walked toward the visitor center, she felt the familiar burn in her thighs, the slight shortness of breath that accompanied even moderate physical activity. She'd been working on her stamina for months, taking increasingly longer walks around her neighborhood in Tulsa, but she knew the mountain air would present an additional challenge. Inside, the center buzzed with tourists, clustered around a large, topographical map. A bearded ranger was pointing out various features to an eager family, their matching North Face jackets suggesting serious outdoor enthusiasts. Melissa felt suddenly self-conscious in her size 3X hiking pants and custom-ordered boots. She'd spent a small fortune on specialty outdoor gear from a company that catered to plus-size adventurers, but surrounded by lean, tanned hikers, she felt conspicuously out of place. Tammy must have sensed her discomfort because she hooked her arm through Melissa's and steered her toward a less crowded display about local wildlife. Let's check this out while Brad gets some information about the lodge. The display featured life-sized silhouettes of various animals found in the park, including an imposing grizzly bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over 7 feet tall. Beside it, a plaque detailed the difference between grizzly and black bears, emphasizing that both should be treated with utmost caution. Woodland wisdom. Bear safety for backcountry travelers, Melissa read from one of her brochures. Make noise while hiking. Avoid hiking at dawn, dusk, or night when bears are most active. Keep all food, garbage, and scented items suspended from trees at least 100 yards from your sleeping area. She looked up at Tammy. I've practically memorized this stuff. I know you have, Tammy said. You're probably better prepared than half the people heading into the backcountry. Brad rejoined them, a park map in hand. I got us a room at the lodge for the next 4 nights. That gives you tomorrow to do a shorter day hike and get used to the terrain, then your overnight on Wednesday, and a recovery day afterward before we head to Yellowstone. Melissa felt a surge of gratitude for her cousin and his wife. They'd rearranged their entire vacation to accommodate her backcountry adventure, even though she knew they would have preferred to stick to well-traveled trails and comfortable lodges. Thank you, she said, hugging them both. I know this isn't exactly what you had in mind for your summer vacation. Are you kidding? Brad said, returning the hug. Tammy's been dying to try out that fancy camera her parents got her for Christmas, and this place is a photographer's dream. Later that afternoon, back in their lodge room, Melissa spread her gear across the bed, doing one final inventory before her short practice hike the next day. Sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to 20 degrees. Lightweight but sturdy tent. First aid kit. Headlamp with extra batteries, water filter, camp stove, freeze-dried meals, bear bells, rope for hanging food. Everything on the recommended list, plus a few extras like her journal and a small tape recorder to document her thoughts along the trail. She picked up a pamphlet titled Solo Hiking, Risks and Rewards that she'd grabbed from the visitor center. The cover featured a lone hiker, thin, fit and male, standing atop a rocky outcrop, arms raised in triumph. Nowhere in these brochures did she see anyone who looked like her, but that didn't mean she couldn't be that triumphant figure. She carefully packed her backpack. Arranging the weight for optimal balance, Melissa rehearsed what she would say if she encountered other hikers on the trail. She'd practiced her confident nod, her casual, beautiful day, isn't it? She'd prepared herself for the surprised looks, the concerned questions about whether she was alone, whether she knew what was ahead. She was ready for all of it. What she wasn't prepared for was how right it would feel to stand at the trailhead, to see the path winding ahead into the forest, promising solitude and challenge, and whatever version of herself might emerge on the other side. That moment was still to come, but as she zipped her fully packed backpack and set it by the door, Melissa felt a surge of anticipation that drowned out all the doubts, both her own and those of everyone who had ever told her what she couldn't do. Tomorrow was just a practice run. The real adventure would begin the day after, when she would finally strike out on her own into the wilderness that had called to her for so long. 7 miles to campsite 3C4, one night under the stars, and then back again, carrying with her the knowledge that she had done something remarkable, not in spite of her body but with it, exactly as it was. The morning of June 15th dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed designed specifically for adventure. Melissa woke before her alarm, her body humming with nervous energy. Outside their lodge room window, the first golden rays of sunlight were just beginning to illuminate the jagged peaks of the Tetons, transforming them from shadowy sentinels to majestic monuments. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Brad and Tammy just yet. Her hiking clothes had been laid out the night before, moisture-wicking pants with reinforced knees, a lightweight long-sleeved shirt to protect against both sun and insects, and her prized hiking boots, broken in over months of preparation. The boots had cost nearly a month's salary from her job at the public library, but they were worth every penny. Finding outdoor gear that properly fit her 300-pound frame had been a challenge, but she'd refused to compromise on quality or safety. In the bathroom, Melissa pulled her thick auburn hair into a practical braid and studied her reflection. There was color in her cheeks already, a combination of excitement and the clear mountain air. She'd always been self-conscious about her double chin and round face, but today she saw something different in the mirror, determination in her hazel eyes, strength in the set of her jaw. Today was about proving something, not to the world but to herself. By the time Brad and Tammy stirred, Melissa had triple-checked her pack, eaten a protein-rich breakfast and filled her water reservoirs. She sat cross-legged on the floor, studying the trail map one last time when Brad emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're up early," he yawned, reaching for the coffee pot. "Couldn't sleep," Melissa admitted, too excited. Brad studied her for a moment, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know you can still change your mind. No one would think less of you." Melissa folded the map deliberately, tucking it into the side pocket of her pack. "I would," she said simply. The drive to Aspen Creek trailhead took just under an hour, the rental car climbing steadily along winding mountain roads. Melissa sat in the back seat, her backpack beside her like a traveling companion. She'd insisted on wearing it around the lodge parking lot for 20 minutes that morning, making final adjustments to the straps and weight distribution. Even with careful packing and selection of ultralight gear, the pack weighed nearly 40 pounds, a significant load, but one she'd trained for. Tammy kept the conversation flowing during the drive, chattering about the wildlife they'd spotted the previous day and the photographs she hoped to take while Melissa was on her adventure. Brad was quieter, his hands tight on the steering wheel as they navigated the increasingly remote roads. When they finally pulled into the small gravel lot that marked the trailhead, it was empty save for a single pickup truck with Forest Service insignia on the door. The solitude was exactly what Melissa had hoped for. No audience for her departure, no curious or judgmental eyes to follow her progress. A wooden sign marked the start of the trail, the paint slightly faded from seasons of harsh weather. Aspen Creek Trail, backcountry permits required beyond this point. Below it, a smaller sign warned, Bear Country, food storage required. The reality of what she was about to do suddenly hit Melissa with physical force, a tightness in her chest. That wasn't entirely due to anxiety. She was really going to do this. Walk into these woods alone, carrying everything she needed for survival on her back, and spend a night in the wilderness with only the sounds of nature for company. Brad popped the trunk and helped her lift out her backpack. "One last check," he insisted, opening the various compartments. "Water, food, first aid kit, map and compass, bare bells, all accounted for," Melissa said, trying to keep the impatience from her voice. She understood his concern, but she'd been over this list a dozen times already. "What about your medication?" Tammy asked quietly. Melissa patted the small side pocket of her pack. "Right here, along with my inhaler." She'd managed her mild asthma for years, rarely needing the rescue inhaler except during particularly strenuous activity, but she'd packed it as a precaution against the high elevation. The three of them stood awkwardly for a moment, the weight of the impending separation hanging between them. Finally, Brad cleared his throat. "We'll hike in with you for the first few miles," he said, "just to help you get your bearings." Melissa started to protest, then reconsidered. Having company for the beginning of the journey might ease some of their worries, and truthfully, it might help calm her own nerves as well. "All right," she agreed, "but just to the first creek crossing. That's about 4 miles in, and I should be able to handle the rest on my own from there." They helped her into her backpack, Brad supporting the weight while she slipped her arms through the straps. The familiar pressure settled across her shoulders and hips, the pack's frame distributing the load as designed. She buckled the hip belt, wincing slightly as it pressed against her substantial midsection, then adjusted the chest strap until the weight felt balanced. "How's it feel?" Tammy asked, eyeing her critically. Melissa took a few experimental steps, feeling the familiar strain in her thighs and calves. "It's good," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Heavy but manageable." The first mile was the hardest. The trail climbed steadily through dense pine forest, the ground carpeted with fallen needles that made footing slightly unpredictable. Melissa's breathing became labored almost immediately, her face flushing, with exertion and embarrassment as Brad and Tammy effortlessly maintained the pace beside her. "We can take a break whenever you need," Brad offered after the first 15 minutes, carefully keeping any judgment from his voice. "Not yet," Melissa managed between breaths. The bear bells attached to her pack jingled with each labored step, a cheerful soundtrack to her struggle. She'd anticipated this difficulty, the combination of elevation, pack weight, and her own size, creating a perfect storm of physical challenge, but she was determined not to show weakness so early in the journey. After the first mile, the Kuki trail leveled slightly, following the contour of a gentle ridge, and Melissa found her rhythm. The initial burning in her legs subsided to a manageable ache, and her breathing, while still heavy, no longer felt like it might tear her lungs apart. She reached for her water bottle, taking a long, grateful swallow. "You're doing great, Mel," Tammy said, snapping a photo of the sunlight filtering through the canopy ahead. "This is farther than most tourists ever get from their cars." The compliment, though well-intentioned, stung slightly. Melissa didn't want to be graded on a curve, didn't want acknowledgement for doing what anyone else might do without comment. But she smiled and nodded, saving her breath for the journey. By the third mile, Melissa had settled into the hike, her body finding a pace it could sustain. The forest around them had changed subtly, the pines interspersed now with aspen groves, whose leaves shimmered silver-green in the occasional breeze. The undergrowth was lusher here, suggesting a water source nearby, and indeed, they soon heard the gurgling of Aspen Creek before they saw it. The creek crossing consisted of a series of flat stepping stones arranged across the shallow, swift-running water. On the far bank, a small wooden sign indicated the junction where the trail split, left continuing along Aspen Creek Trail toward campsite 3C4 and right leading to Beaver Meadows. Melissa eased her pack off, setting it carefully on a flat rock while she consulted her map. "This is where we part ways," she said, tracing the route with her finger. "I follow the left fork for another 3 miles or so to reach my campsite." Brad frowned, scanning the dense forest on the other side of the creek. "You sure you don't want us to go a little farther with you? That crossing looks tricky with a full pack." Melissa shook her head, a strand of auburn hair escaping her braid to cling to her damp forehead. "I've got this, really." She took a long drink from her water bottle, then refilled it from the creek, adding purification tablets that would make it safe to drink after 30 minutes. Tammy stepped forward and embraced her, seemingly unconcerned about Melissa's sweat-soaked shirt. "Be careful out there," she whispered fiercely. "Remember everything you've learned." "I will," Melissa promised, returning the hug. "And I'll have great stories to tell when I see you tomorrow evening." Brad's hug was briefer, but no less intense. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, turn around and come back. There's no shame in changing plans." Melissa nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of turning back. She'd come too far, prepared too thoroughly to abandon her adventure now. With a deep breath, she hefted her backpack, settling it onto her shoulders with a grunt of effort. The first 3 miles had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, her thighs trembling slightly with fatigue as she secured the hip belt. But there was only one way forward, and that was through. The creek crossing required careful concentration. The stones were slick with spray, and the added weight and altered balance of her pack made each step precarious. Halfway across, on a particularly narrow stone, Melissa felt herself wobble, her arms windmilling briefly as she fought for balance. Behind her, she heard Brad's sharp intake of breath, but she steadied herself and continued, determination driving her forward. On the far bank, she turned and waved, forcing brightness into her smile. "See you tomorrow evening at the trailhead," she called, adjusting her pack straps. "Don't worry about me, be safe," Tammy called back, her voice already sounding distant against the gurgle of the creek. Melissa raised her hand in a final farewell, then turned and continued up the trail, her bear bells jingling with each step. The sound of the bells seemed louder, now that she was alone, a reminder of both safety and solitude. The forest closed around her like an embrace, the sounds of Brad and Tammy's return journey quickly fading beneath the whisper of wind through aspen leaves and the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the trail. For the first time since they'd entered the park, Melissa felt the tension drain from her shoulders. Here, alone in the wilderness, the judgments and expectations that had shadowed her throughout her life seemed to matter less. Here she was just another hiker, her worth measured not by her size or appearance, but by her preparation, determination, and respect for the natural world. As the trail climbed more steeply, following the creek upstream toward higher elevations, Melissa settled into a pace she could maintain, one foot in front of the other, breath measured, mind focused on the immediacy of the journey rather than its destination. The discomfort in her body, the strain in her legs, the pressure of the pack straps against her shoulders, the sweat trickling between her shoulder blades was just information, neither good nor bad, simply the reality of moving her 300-pound body through this wild and beautiful landscape. By mid-afternoon, the character of the forest had changed again. The aspens had given way to scattered meadows carpeted with wildflowers, purple lupine, scarlet paintbrush, golden balsam root, their colors vibrant against the green backdrop. In one such meadow, Melissa paused to rest, easing her pack off and sitting on a fallen log. She unwrapped a granola bar and chewed thoughtfully, watching a pair of Clark's nutcrackers squabble in a nearby pine. According to her map, she was just over a mile from her designated campsite. The day's hike had been challenging but manageable, each mile building her confidence for the return journey tomorrow. As she stretched her tired muscles and readjusted her pack for the final push, Melissa felt a profound sense of accomplishment already taking root. Whatever happened next, whether she reached her campsite as planned or encountered unexpected obstacles, she had already proven something essential to herself. That adventures weren't reserved for the thin and athletic, that wild places held space for bodies of all sizes, that her determination could carry her farther than anyone, including herself, might have believed possible. With renewed energy, Melissa continued along the trail, her bear bells announcing her presence to the wilderness. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows across the path ahead, illuminating the way forward, one step at a time. Brad checked his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. Across the Aspen Creek trailhead parking lot, 4:30. Melissa was late. She probably just got a late start this morning, Tammy said, leaning against the rental car's hood. Her calm tone belied the worry in her eyes as she scanned the tree line where the trail disappeared into dense forest. I know, Brad nodded. Though they both knew that Melissa was meticulously punctual by nature, she'd been adamant about meeting them at the trailhead by 1 o'clock, calculating 7 hours for the return hike, a generous time frame that accounted for rest breaks and her slower pace. The parking lot had been busy earlier in the day, families and groups of hikers coming and going, their chatter and laughter a welcome distraction from the growing knot in Brad's stomach. Now, as the afternoon waned, the lot had emptied except for their rental car and a mud-spattered jeep belonging to a pair of fishermen who'd headed downstream hours ago. Maybe she decided to take more photos than she planned, Tammy suggested, scrolling through the pictures on her digital camera to pass the time. You know how she gets when she finds something that catches her eye? Brad tried to smile, but the expression felt stiff on his face. Maybe they'd spent the previous day exploring the more accessible trails around Pine Ridge Lodge while Melissa was on her solo adventure. Tammy had been delighted by the wildlife, a mother moose and calf feeding in a marshy area, a red fox darting across their path, countless songbirds and a golden eagle soaring overhead. She'd photographed it all, already planning the scrapbook she would make of their western vacation. Throughout the day, though, both of them had found their thoughts returning to Melissa, alone in the backcountry. They'd checked the weather reports obsessively, relieved to see clear skies predicted with no chance of storms that might catch her unprepared. Now, as another hour crept by without any sign of Melissa emerging from the forest, Brad's anxiety escalated from a simmer to a rolling boil. It's 5:30, he said, pushing away from the car where he'd been leaning. She's 4.5 hours late. Tammy lowered her camera, no longer pretending to be absorbed in her photographs. What do you want to do? I think we should head back to the ranger station and report her overdue. Brad was already moving toward the driver's door. It'll be dark in a few hours. The drive back to Pine Ridge Visitor Center seemed to take an eternity, though it was only 20 minutes along the winding park road. Brad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight that a dull ache had started behind his right ear. Beside him, Tammy was uncharacteristically quiet, her usual chatter replaced by tense silence. The visitor center was preparing to close when they arrived, a ranger flipping the sign on the door to closed, just as Brad pulled into a parking space. Tammy was out of the car before he'd fully stopped, waving frantically to catch the ranger's attention. "Please wait, we need help," she called, her voice cracking. The ranger, a woman in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and a name tag reading Sanchez, held the door open as they approached. "What's the problem?" she asked, taking in their obvious distress. "My cousin," Brad said, the words tumbling out. "She went hiking yesterday to campsite 3C4 on the Aspen Creek Trail. She was supposed to meet us at the trailhead at 1 o'clock today, but she never showed up." Ranger Sanchez's expression shifted from polite interest to focused concern. "Come inside," she said, holding the door wider. "I need to get some information from you." Inside, the visitor center was empty of tourists, another ranger cleaning display cases while a third counted the day's cash register receipts. Ranger Sanchez led them to a small office off the main hall, pulling out a form labeled Overdue Hiker Report. "Let's start with her full name," she said, pen poised over the form. "Melissa Johnson," Brad supplied. "She's 35 years old, from Tulsa, Oklahoma." "Physical description?" Brad hesitated, glancing at Tammy. They both knew Melissa's size would likely be the first thing mentioned in any description of her. "She's about 5'8", Tammy said. 300 pounds. Auburn hair in a braid. Hazel eyes. She was wearing tan hiking pants and a blue long-sleeved shirt when we last saw her." Ranger Sanchez nodded, making notes. "Any medical conditions or medications we should be aware of?" "She has mild asthma," Brad said. "She carries an inhaler, and she takes a prescription for high blood pressure." "Did she have proper supplies? Food, water, shelter?" Brad nodded vigorously. "She was very prepared. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 days, water filter, first aid kit. She had those bear bells attached to her pack. She read all the brochures, followed all the guidelines." "When exactly did you last see her?" "Yesterday around 11 in the morning," Tammy supplied. "We hiked in with her about 4 miles to the first creek crossing, then she continued on her own. And she was definitely planning to return today. There's no chance she decided to extend her trip." Brad shook his head firmly. "No way. She was very specific about meeting us at 1 o'clock today. We drove to the trailhead this morning and waited. We're still waiting, but it's been over 4 hours now." His voice cracked and he swallowed hard. Tammy reached over and squeezed his hand. Ranger Sanchez completed the form, then picked up a radio. "I'm going to alert our search and rescue coordinator," she explained. "We'll get a team organized right away, but I should warn you that if she's still on the trail, we probably won't find her before nightfall." Brad nodded numbly, the reality of the situation sinking in. Melissa was out there somewhere, possibly injured, definitely alone, and soon it would be dark. "What happens if you don't find her tonight?" Tammy asked, her voice small. "We'll resume at first light with additional resources," Ranger Sanchez assured her. "We have protocols for these situations. Our primary concern is her safety. The next, hour passed in a blur of activity. More rangers arrived, maps were consulted, and a search plan was formulated. Brad and Tammy answered the same questions multiple times as different members of the search team arrived. When did they last see her? What route was she taking? Did she have any wilderness experience? What supplies did she carry? Each time Brad described Melissa's meticulous preparation, he felt a surge of pride mingled with his worry. His cousin had always been thorough, always researched everything extensively before attempting it. If anyone could handle an unexpected situation in the backcountry, it was Melissa. But as night fell and the search was temporarily suspended until morning, that confidence began to waver. Brad and Tammy checked into a small motel near the park entrance, neither of them suggesting they return to the lodge, where Melissa's belongings remained in their shared room. They sat side by side on the sagging mattress, picking at the sandwiches they'd bought from a gas station on the way, neither of them hungry but knowing they should eat. "She'll be okay," Tammy said into the silence, but the assertion hung in the air like a question. Brad nodded, unable to voice the scenarios playing through his mind. Melissa falling on a steep section of trail, injuring herself with no one to help. Melissa having an asthma attack triggered by exertion and elevation. Melissa encountering a bear or moose despite her precautions. He'd never wanted her to make this trip alone. Not because he didn't believe she was capable. Melissa was one of the most capable people he knew. But because the wilderness was unpredictable and humans were vulnerable out there, regardless of preparation or ability. "I should have insisted on going with her," he said, setting aside his half-eaten sandwich. "You know she wouldn't have let you," Tammy replied softly. This was something she needed to do on her own. Brad knew she was right. Melissa had been fighting other people's limitations on her all her life. What she could wear, where she could go, what activities were appropriate for her body size. This solo hike was about proving something to herself, and having Brad tag along would have defeated the purpose. Still, as he lay awake in the unfamiliar motel room, listening to Tammy's steady breathing beside him, he couldn't help thinking that whatever Melissa had needed to prove wasn't worth her safety. Dawn arrived with the harsh ring of the motel room phone. Brad fumbled for it in the dim light, his heart racing. "Mr. Johnson? This is Ranger Davis from Pine Ridge. We're assembling the search teams now and wanted to let you know you can join us at the visitor center if you'd like to be updated throughout the day." "We'll be right there," Brad said, already reaching for his clothes. The visitor center was a hive of activity when they arrived. Park rangers in their distinctive uniforms mixed with volunteers in outdoor gear. Maps were spread across tables, radios crackled with static and voices, and someone had set up a coffee station in the corner. Ranger Thompson, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard who'd been introduced the previous evening as the search and rescue coordinator, waved them over. "We've divided the area into search zones," he explained, pointing to a large topographical map with colored sections. "I've got Ranger Marshall covering the Estrogen Creek Trail by horseback. He can cover more ground that way. Rangers Berg and Dagelberg are searching the Upper Pelican area. We've got a volunteer, Nelson Scott, covering the area between those two trails. That should encompass the entire trail system your cousin indicated she'd be traveling on." Brad studied the map, trying to visualize Melissa's planned route. "What about aerial searches?" "We've requested a helicopter from Yellowstone, but they're dealing with a medical evacuation this morning. They'll join us as soon as they can." Tammy squeezed Brad's arm. "They'll find her." By mid-morning, reports began filtering in from the search teams. Ranger Berg radioed that campsite 3C4 was unoccupied and appeared to have been for several days. Nelson Scott reported no sign of recent human activity along his assigned section of trail. Brad and Tammy sat in the visitor center, accepting cups of coffee from volunteers but barely drinking them, watching the clock tick inexorably forward. Each hour that passed without news seemed to draw the oxygen from the room a little more. Just before noon, Ranger Thompson approached them, his expression carefully neutral. "We've had a development," he said. "Ranger Marshall has found what appears to be a campsite, but not at the designated location. It's at an older site that's no longer marked on our current maps, about 2 miles short of campsite 3C4. Brad stood, his heart hammering. "Is it Melissa's? Is she there?" Thompson's hesitation was answer enough. "He's found some belongings that match your description. He's requesting additional personnel at the location immediately." "What does that mean?" Tammy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did he find?" "I don't have all the details yet," Thompson said, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "But from his radio communication, I believe there are signs of disturbance at the campsite." Brad felt the room tilt slightly, Tammy's hand on his arm the only thing keeping him upright. "We need to go there," he said. "Right now." Thompson shook his head. "I understand your concern, but we need to let the investigation team do their job first. They're being flown in by helicopter. As soon as we have more information, I promise you'll be the first to know." The next hours were the longest of Brad's life. He and Tammy sat side by side in hard plastic chairs, barely speaking, each lost in their own thoughts as park personnel moved purposefully around them. Occasionally, someone would offer them food or fresh coffee, which they accepted mechanically, barely tasting anything. At 3 o'clock, Ranger Thompson returned, accompanied by a woman in a khaki uniform with a park service badge and a man in civilian clothes who was introduced as Detective Morris from the county sheriff's office. The expression on their faces made Brad's stomach drop. He felt Tammy's hand find his, her fingers ice cold. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Ranger Thompson began, then corrected himself. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, Miss Wilson. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." As the ranger continued speaking, his words seemed to come from a great distance, as if Brad were hearing them underwater. "Campsite found. Signs of animal intrusion. Evidence of a bear attack. Remains recovered." Each phrase registered individually, but refused to coalesce into a comprehensible whole. It wasn't until the detective gently mentioned identifying the body that the terrible reality crashed through Brad's shock. Melissa was gone. His vibrant, determined, joy-filled cousin would never emerge from those woods, would never tell them about her adventure, would never prove all the doubters wrong. Beside him, Tammy had begun to sob, quiet, broken sounds that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Brad put his arm around her shoulders automatically, his own grief too vast and jagged to find expression yet. "How," he began, then swallowed hard. "What happened to her?" The officials exchanged glances, clearly weighing how much detail to share. It was Detective Morris who finally spoke, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Based on the evidence at the scene, it appears your cousin set up her camp according to all safety guidelines. She was attacked while sleeping. A bear, most likely a young male, managed to access her food cache despite proper hanging techniques, and then may have been drawn to her tent. The clinical description was somehow worse than anything Brad's imagination had conjured during the long night. The thought of Melissa, alone and vulnerable in her tent, confronted by a predator against which she had no defense, was unbearable. She did everything right, Tammy whispered through her tears. She followed all the rules. Ranger Thompson nodded solemnly. Yes, she did. Sometimes, despite all precautions, these tragic incidents occur. Bears are wild animals, and their behavior can be unpredictable. Brad barely heard the rest of the conversation. Details about recovering Melissa's remains, about notifications and paperwork, about the investigation that would follow. All he could think about was the excited light in Melissa's eyes as she described her planned adventure, the determination in her voice when she insisted she could handle it alone. She'd wanted so badly to prove herself, to experience the wilderness on her own terms. In the end, her preparation and determination had not been enough against the random cruelty of nature. As they left the visitor center, the late afternoon sun still bright in a cloudless sky, Brad found himself staring at the distant mountains. Somewhere in those vast, beautiful, indifferent forests, Melissa had found both the solitude she sought and a fate she never imagined. Tammy slipped her hand into his as they walked to the car, their shadows stretching long across the parking lot. She was happy out there, she said softly. Whatever happened, she was doing exactly what she wanted to do. Brad nodded, holding on to that small comfort as they prepared to face the unimaginable task of returning to Oklahoma without Melissa. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine as Ranger Marshall guided his chestnut mare along the narrow trail. The horse's hooves fell quietly on the dirt path, occasionally snapping a fallen twig or rustling through patches of dried leaves. After 15 years patrolling these mountains, Marshall knew every switchback and stream crossing on the Estrogen Creek Trail, but today the familiar route felt different, heavy with purpose and dread. He'd volunteered immediately when the search coordinator announced they needed someone to cover this section of trail. Melissa Johnson's description, a solo female hiker, meticulously prepared but vulnerable in her isolation, had stirred something protective in him. Though he'd never met her, he felt responsible somehow, as if the safety of every visitor who ventured into his wilderness was a personal obligation. The radio clipped to his jacket crackled occasionally with updates from other search teams. So far, nothing. Campsite 3C4 had been empty, showing no signs of recent use. The helicopter from Yellowstone would be arriving within the hour to begin aerial sweeps. Standard procedure for a missing hiker scenario, but Marshall could sense the growing tension in each transmission. A night had passed. The statistical window for finding someone alive and uninjured was narrowing. His mare's ears pricked forward suddenly, and she snorted, pulling slightly against the reins. Marshall patted her neck. "What is it, girl? You smell something?" 20 years of backcountry experience had taught him to trust his horse's instincts. He scanned the forest ahead, eyes carefully sweeping the understory of ferns and berry bushes. Nothing moved except the dappled patterns of sunlight filtering through the canopy overhead. They continued forward, the trail curving gently to follow the contour of the slope. As they rounded the bend, the trees opened into a small clearing, one of the old campsites that had been removed from official maps years ago when the park revised its backcountry management plan. Site 5W1, if he remembered correctly, decommissioned because it was too close to a wildlife corridor. From a distance, the clearing appeared empty, just a grassy space framed by lodgepole pines and a fallen log that rangers had once designated as a bench next to a fire ring. But as Marshall drew closer, he noticed an unnatural splash of color against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor, the distinctive blue-gray of ripstop nylon. A tent. His pulse quickened as he dismounted, tying his horse to a sturdy pine at the clearing's edge. "Hello?" he called out, his voice carrying through the still morning air. "Park service, anyone here?" The silence that answered him carried its own message. Marshall approached cautiously, years of training governing his movements. First, he noted the campsite's layout, meticulously arranged according to backcountry guidelines. The blue-gray tent was set facing west, positioned on a flat patch of ground about 20 yards from a cold fire ring. A food bag hung suspended. between two trees at the proper height and distance from the sleeping area. Everything by the book. Then he noticed the tier. The fabric of the tent was ripped along one side near the entrance, a jagged, deliberate gash about 27 inches long. Not the kind of damage caused by weather or equipment failure. This was the work of claws or teeth. "Oh no," he breathed, reaching for his radio. He hesitated before pressing the transmit button, wanting more information before he alarmed the search team and the missing woman's family waiting anxiously at the visitor center, following protocol for approaching a potentially contaminated scene. Marshall circled the campsite, examining the ground for tracks or blood sign. The forest floor told its story to his trained eyes. The distinctive five-toed prints of a medium-sized bear, probably young based on size, had approached the campsite from the northeast, moving with purpose rather than the meandering pattern of a foraging animal. The tracks led directly to the suspended food cache, which now hung limply, its contents scattered on the ground below. From there, the bear had moved to the tent, and then Marshall followed the disturbed earth and bent vegetation leading away from the campsite toward a stand of denser trees. Only then did he key his radio. "Base, this is Marshall at the old 5W1 site on Estrogen Creek Trail." He kept his voice level, professional. "I've found what appears to be Johnson's campsite. Signs of bear activity. No visual on the subject. Requesting immediate backup and the investigation team." The radio crackled with the search coordinator's response, asking for details he wasn't ready to provide. Not until he was certain, not until he'd completed his assessment. He promised a full report when the team arrived, then clipped the radio back to his jacket. Marshall returned to the tent, approaching the entrance with measured steps. Standard procedure dictated he should wait for the investigation team before disturbing potential evidence, but his instincts pushed him to look inside. If by some miracle Melissa Johnson was injured, but alive in there, he knelt beside the tent and carefully lifted the rain flap, his chest tight with dread and fading hope. The interior of the tent was undisturbed, except for the tier, presenting an eerie tableau of interrupted routine. A sleeping pad lay flat on the tent floor, and beside it, nearly arranged, were a plastic bag containing folded clothes, a container of lip balm with SPF protection, and a prescription bottle labeled Micarin. On the other side of the sleeping pad sat a flashlight in the off position and a small tape recorder. No blood, no signs of struggle inside the tent, just the ordinary possessions of a hiker who had stepped away or been taken away from her shelter. Marshall backed out of the tent and stood, scanning the campsite again with fresh eyes. That's when he noticed something he'd missed in his initial survey. A sleeping bag laid out flat about 6 feet behind the tent, as if it had been placed there to air out or dry in the sun. But as he approached, the hair on the back of his neck rose. The sleeping bag bore puncture marks at the level where a person's neck would be, and about 18 inches below that, a tear that matched the claw pattern of the bear tracks he'd observed. The sleeping bag's fabric was stained dark in places. Dried blood? The story of what happened here began to take terrible shape in Marshall's mind. The bear had approached in the night, perhaps initially attracted by the food cache. Despite the proper hanging technique, the animal had managed to access it, not uncommon for the more agile younger bears. Then, possibly protecting its stolen meal or simply following the scent of the human occupant, it had approached the tent. What happened next made Marshall's stomach clench. The bear had torn open the tent and encountered Melissa Johnson in her sleeping bag. The evidence suggested it had bitten onto her neck or skull through the sleeping bag and dragged her, still inside the bag, straight out through the tear in the tent. About 6 feet from the tent, where the sleeping bag now lay, the bear had pulled her from the protective covering. From there, Marshall forced himself to follow the faint drag trail leading away from the campsite. The disturbed ground and vegetation created a tragic breadcrumb trail into the forest. Along the way, he found a bloody sweater, torn by claws and teeth, and further on a cotton t-shirt in similar condition. He stopped, unwilling to continue alone. He'd seen enough bear attacks in his career to know what he would find at the end of that trail, and protocol demanded he preserve the scene for the investigation team. With heavy steps, he returned to the campsite and his patient horse. As he waited for the helicopter carrying the investigation team, Marshall found himself studying the campsite again, looking for mistakes, for something Melissa Johnson could have done differently. But the truth was inescapable. Her camp had been textbook perfect. Food properly stored, cooking area separate from sleeping area, no food or scented items in the tent except perhaps traces of lip balm. She had followed every guideline, read every brochure, taken every precaution available to backcountry campers. Sometimes it just wasn't enough. The distant thrum of helicopter rotors eventually broke the silence of the clearing. Marshall stepped out to wave them down, directing them to a landing spot in a meadow about a quarter-mile away. Within 30 minutes, the investigation team had arrived at the campsite. 2 Park Service forensic specialists, a wildlife biologist, and a county medical examiner. Marshall briefed them on his findings, then led them along the drag trail he'd discovered earlier. About 250 feet from the tent, they found what remained of Melissa Johnson. The scene was handled with professional detachment, evidence photographed and collected, remains prepared for transport. But beneath the clinical procedure, Marshall could sense the same question weighing on all of them. How could this happen to someone who had done everything right? Back at the campsite, the investigation team worked methodically, documenting every detail. One specialist examined the tear in the tent, measuring its dimensions and photographing the jagged edges. Another collected samples from the sleeping bag while the biologist studied the bear tracks, making casts of the most defined prints. Based on track size and dentition marks, we're looking at a sub-adult bear, probably 2 to 3 years old, the biologist said, measuring the space between claw marks on the sleeping bag. Too young to have established a solid territory, but old enough to be independent and hungry. The medical examiner approached from where she'd been examining the remains. Preliminary cause of death appears to be hemorrhage and shock from multiple lacerations consistent with bear attack. Full autopsy will confirm, but time of death was likely between midnight and 3 a.m. based on lividity and body temperature. Marshall nodded grimly. The timeline matched his theory. Melissa Johnson had made camp, arranged everything according to guidelines and settled in for the night, likely feeling secure in her preparation. Then, in the darkest hours, the attack had come, swift, brutal, and impossible to predict or prevent. As the team continued their work, Marshall found himself examining the contents of Melissa's backpack, which had been left inside the tent. The items told the story of a woman who had researched thoroughly and planned carefully. Maps with highlighted routes, a journal with neat notes about trail conditions and wildlife sightings, brochures about bear safety, some with underlined passages and margin notes. One brochure particularly caught his eye: Grizzly Country. Enjoy them at a distance. The irony was almost too much to bear. By late afternoon, the investigation was complete enough to transport Melissa's remains back to the helipad. As the team packed up their equipment, Marshall took one final look around the campsite. In a few days, there would be little evidence that this clearing had been the site of such tragedy. The tent and gear would be removed, the drag marks would fade with the next rain, and the forest would reclaim the space, indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded here. But for Marshall, this clearing would never be just another spot on his patrol route again. He would always see it as the place where Melissa Johnson's adventure ended, where her meticulous preparation and genuine respect for wilderness safety had not been enough to save her from the unpredictable reality of wild places. As he mounted his horse for the ride back, Marshall thought about what he would tell the search coordinator, what the rangers would tell Melissa's waiting family. How do you explain that someone can do everything right and still meet tragedy? How do you continue to encourage people to venture into the backcountry after such a stark reminder of its dangers? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain: the parks would review their bear management policies, refine their guidelines for backcountry campers, and emphasize group travel over solo adventures. Perhaps Melissa's story would save others, a small comfort in an otherwise senseless loss. Marshall guided his horse back onto the trail, the animal's steady gait carrying him away from the campsite. Behind him, the forest stood silent, neither malevolent nor benign, simply wild, a place where humans were visitors, never fully in control despite their best preparations and precautions. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, a young bear continued its life, unaware of the human grief its natural instincts had caused, moving through a landscape where survival, not malice, governed every action. The investigation team moved with practiced efficiency through the dappled forest light, their voices low and professional as they documented the tragic scene. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the county medical examiner, knelt beside what remained of Melissa Johnson, her gloved hands gentle yet clinical as she assessed the wounds that told the story of the woman's final moments. Multiple lacerations consistent with ursine dentition and claw patterns, she dictated into a small recorder clipped to her jacket. Primary trauma appears to be to the neck and upper thoracic region. Defensive wounds present on forearms and hands. Behind her, wildlife biologist Tom Reeves photographed the disturbed earth around the body. the drag marks leading back toward the campsite, and the distinctive paw prints pressed into the soft forest floor. He'd been tracking and studying the bears in this region for over a decade, but scenes like this still affected him deeply. The stark reminder of humankind's vulnerability in the wilderness he loved. The drag trail extends approximately 250 feet from the victim's tent, he noted, measuring the distance with a laser rangefinder. Consistent with a medium-sized bear, likely a black bear based on track morphology, though we'll need to confirm with DNA analysis. Park Service investigator Sarah Collins moved methodically between the body site and the campsite, coordinating the evidence collection and creating a timeline of events. 20 years in backcountry law enforcement had given her a keen eye for the subtle details that others might miss. "Look at this," she called to Reeves, pointing to a tree about 15 feet from where Melissa's food bag had been suspended. Deep claw marks scored the trunk, extending up to a height of nearly 7 feet. The bear climbed up, probably managed to reach out far enough to snag the rope or the bag itself. Reeves examined the marks, running his fingers lightly over the gouges in the bark. "Young male, I'd guess. They're the most agile and opportunistic. Probably learned this trick elsewhere. We've had reports of similar food cache raids over in the eastern sector last month." As the team worked, the helicopter waited in a nearby meadow, rotors occasionally spinning to maintain operational readiness. The pilot had been instructed to stand by for immediate evacuation of both the investigation team and Melissa's remains once their work was complete. At the campsite, Ranger Marshal and forensic technician David Wong carefully catalogued every item in and around Melissa's tent, photographing the scene from multiple angles before disturbing anything. Sleeping pad, clothing in waterproof bag, flashlight still in the off position, Wong documented, speaking into his own recorder. Lip balm with SPF protection, prescription medication labeled Micarin, appears to be for respiratory support. Tape recorder with depleted batteries. Marshall unzipped the backpack found inside the tent and carefully removed its contents. Maps with highlighted routes, a journal with neat, meticulous handwriting, several park brochures about backcountry safety and bear awareness, some with passages underlined and notes in the margins. "She did her homework," he said quietly, leafing through a pamphlet titled "Grizzly Country, Enjoy Them at a Distance." Melissa had circled a paragraph about proper food storage and written "essential" beside it. Wong nodded grimly. Everything by the book. Food hung correctly, camp laid out, properly, no food in the tent. She followed all the guidelines. The tent itself told part of the story. The 27-inch tear in the fabric near the entrance flap had jagged edges consistent with bear claws. Inside, the sleeping pad showed no signs of blood or struggle, suggesting Melissa had been dragged out while still in her sleeping bag. The sleeping bag, found about 6 feet from the tent, bore the most telling evidence. Puncture marks approximately at neck level, consistent with a bear's canine teeth, and slash marks about 18 inches below that, matched a bear's claw pattern. Dark stains on the synthetic fabric confirmed what the investigators already knew. This was where the attack had begun. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Vasquez had completed her preliminary examination. "Based on liver temperature and livor mortis, I estimate time of death between midnight and 3 a.m., she reported to the investigation team gathered at the campsite. Cause of death appears to be hemorrhagic shock due to multiple traumatic injuries consistent with a bear attack. Any indication of what might have provoked the attack? Collins asked, though they all knew bear behavior could be unpredictable and often defied simple explanations. Reeves shook his head. Nothing obvious. The bear accessed the food cache first based on the disturbance pattern. Typical behavior would be to take the food and leave. The attack on the tent was secondary and unexpected. Could she have had food scents on her clothing? Or in the tent, Marshall suggested. Maybe residual odors from dinner. Wong had already examined the cooking area, located at the proper distance from the sleeping site. No evidence of improper food handling. She used the designated fire ring, and from the contents of her dishwashing kit she appeared to have cleaned everything thoroughly. We found her toothpaste and other toiletries properly stored with the food cache, not in the tent. What about the lip balm? Collins pointed to the small tube documented in their evidence photos. Dr. Vasquez considered this. Possibly. Some bears are attracted to artificial scents, even in small amounts, but honestly, that's reaching. This looks more like a young, opportunistic bear that got into the food cache and then, for whatever reason, territorial defense, curiosity, predatory instinct, approached the tent. The team continued their methodical documentation, each piece of evidence adding to the tragic narrative. Melissa Johnson, an experienced and well-prepared hiker, had done everything right according to park guidelines and backcountry wisdom. She had hung her food properly, kept scented items out of her tent, and maintained a clean campsite. Yet a young bear had still managed to access her food, approach her tent, and launch a fatal attack. The investigation wasn't just about determining what had happened. The evidence made that brutally clear, but about understanding why, in hopes of preventing similar tragedies in the future. As the afternoon waned, Collins gathered the team for a final assessment before preparing to evacuate the site. Based on our findings, what changes should we recommend to the backcountry protocols? Reeves was the first to respond. The food hanging technique clearly needs review. This bear figured out how to defeat it, and others will too. We should fast-track those bear-resistant food canisters we've been testing and make them mandatory for backcountry permits. Campsite locations too, Marshall added. This site was decommissioned for a reason, too close to a wildlife corridor. We need to review all active sites for similar risks. And solo hiking, Wong said quietly. The data is clear that groups are significantly safer in bear country. We should at least require a minimum of 2 people for certain high-risk areas. Collins nodded, making notes. Dr. Vasquez, anything from your perspective? The medical examiner had been quiet, still processing the scene. The victim didn't have time to defend herself or use any deterrents. We should emphasize keeping bear deterrents, when they become more widely available, within immediate reach during sleep, not packed away. As the team prepared Melissa's remains for transport, Reeves completed one final sweep of the perimeter, collecting additional hair and scat samples for DNA analysis. Though they couldn't be certain which bear was responsible without genetic confirmation, he had a strong suspicion based on recent reports. There's a young male, probably 2 to 3 years old, that's been reported multiple times in this area, he told Collins as they walked back to the helicopter. Eartag No 42. He's been relocated twice after getting into campgrounds near Pine Ridge Lodge, but he keeps returning, showing increasingly bold behavior around humans. You think it's the same bear? Reeves nodded grimly. The track measurements match, and the modus operandi, climbing to get at hung food, then approaching occupied tents, it's consistent with reports we've had. Until now, he's just been a nuisance, not a threat. This changes everything. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. If Bear No 42 had indeed killed Melissa Johnson, protocol dictated he would have to be located and euthanized. A bear that had attacked a human, particularly one that had consumed human remains, couldn't be allowed to remain in the wild. As the team loaded their equipment and evidence into the helicopter, Marshall took one final look around the campsite. In a few days, there would be little visible evidence of the tragedy that had occurred here. The tent and gear would be removed, the drag marks would fade with the next rain, and the forest would reclaim the space, indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded. But for those tasked with protecting both the wilderness and the people who ventured into it, the lessons of Melissa Johnson's death would not be forgotten. The helicopter lifted off, carrying them back towards civilization and the difficult task of notifying Melissa's family about the details of their findings. Below, the vast expanse of forest stretched to the horizon, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, a place where, despite humanity's best efforts to manage and mitigate risks, wild nature still held the upper hand. 2 days later, the DNA results confirmed what Reeves had suspected. Hair samples collected from Melissa's sleeping bag and clothing matched Bear No 42, a 3-year-old male black bear with a history of food conditioning and habituation to humans. The park superintendent authorized a targeted removal operation, and within 48 hours, wildlife management specialists had located and euthanized the bear. A necropsy performed by Reeves and Dr. Vasquez confirmed their theory. The bear's stomach contents included fragments of the food from Melissa's cache and, more grimly, human tissue. The bear had been healthy, showing no signs of injury or disease that might explain unusually aggressive behavior. He was simply a young, opportunistic predator who had learned that humans meant food and had crossed the critical threshold from nuisance to lethal threat. In the wake of the tragedy, the Interagency Bear Management Committee convened an emergency session to review and revise backcountry protocols. The investigation team's recommendations formed the foundation of new guidelines. Bear-resistant food canisters would become mandatory equipment for all overnight backcountry permits. Campsites too close to known wildlife corridors would be permanently decommissioned. Solo camping would be strongly discouraged, with required waivers for those who insisted on traveling alone. And educational materials would be updated to emphasize the unpredictability of even properly managed bear encounters. A month after Melissa's death, her cousin Brad Johnson returned to Grand Teton National Park with a small bronze plaque. With special permission from the park superintendent and accompanied by Ranger Marshall, he hiked to a viewpoint near where Melissa had camped on her final night. The plaque, affixed to a boulder overlooking the valley, read simply, "In memory of Melissa Johnson, who found joy in wild places. May her story remind us to adventure wisely and respect the wilderness." Marshall watched as Brad secured the plaque, both men silent in their shared grief and understanding. The ranger had seen too many memorials like this one over his career, tributes to those who had come to the wilderness seeking beauty and adventure, only to be reminded of humanity's place in the natural order. "She did everything right," Brad said finally, stepping back to view the plaque. "That's what I still can't get past. She read every guidebook, followed every rule." Marshall nodded, gazing out over the landscape that was both his responsibility and his passion. "Sometimes that's not enough," he said softly. "We try to manage the risks, create guidelines, give people a sense of control. But out here, we're visitors. The rules we make don't always align with the rules that govern wild things." Brad was quiet for a long moment. Would it have made a difference if she hadn't been alone? If Tammy and I had gone with her? The question had haunted Marshall too. "Probably," he admitted. "Bears are less likely to approach groups. More people mean more noise, more human scent, more potential for resistance. But there are no guarantees out here." As they hiked back toward the trailhead, Marshall found himself reflecting on the paradox of his work, encouraging people to experience the transformative power of wilderness while knowing that wilderness, by definition, could never be made completely safe. Every guideline, every regulation, every educational brochure was an attempt to create a middle ground where humans and wild nature could coexist. Melissa Johnson had found that middle ground, had done everything in her power to respect the wilderness while seeking her adventure within it. That her story had ended in tragedy was not a failure of preparation or character, but a stark reminder of the fundamental truth that drew so many to these wild places. Here, humans were not in control, and perhaps that was the most important lesson her death could teach, not that people should fear the wilderness, but that they should enter it with genuine humility and awareness of their place in an order far older and more powerful than any human system or guideline. The conference room at Grand Teton National Park headquarters fell silent as Superintendent Margaret Winters set down the final report on Melissa Johnson's death. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow fell in lazy spirals, blanketing the November landscape in pristine white, a stark contrast to the somber mood within. 6 representatives from the Interagency Bear Management Committee sat around the oak table, their expressions grave as they contemplated the implications of what they'd just reviewed. 3 months since the incident, Winters said, breaking the silence. "I think we've gathered enough data to finalize our recommendations for policy changes." Dr. James Harrison, the committee's senior wildlife biologist, nodded. "The DNA analysis confirms it was definitely bear number 42 responsible for the attack, a 3-year-old male with a documented history of food conditioning and habituation to humans." "The same bear that was relocated twice from Pine Ridge Lodge area?" asked Carol Mendez, representing the Forest Service. "The same," confirmed Harrison. "After the second relocation, he found his way back within 3 weeks. Classic pattern for a bear that's learned to associate human presence with food rewards." Chief Ranger Paul Blackwood, a 25-year veteran of the Park Service, tapped his pen rhythmically against his notepad. "What I can't reconcile is how meticulously Johnson followed safety protocols. Her campsite was textbook perfect. Food hung correctly, cooking area separate from sleeping area, no food in the tent, except that lip balm," pointed out Dr. Elena Vasquez, the medical examiner who had processed the scene. "Though I'm still not convinced that would have been enough to trigger a predatory response. The report indicates the bear accessed the food cache first," Winters reminded them, flipping through the document. "Climbed the tree, somehow reached the bag, despite proper hanging technique. The attack on the tent appears to have been secondary. Territorial defense, perhaps," suggested Harrison. "Once he had the food, he may have perceived Johnson as a threat to his prize. Or it could have been purely predatory," said Blackwood. "Young male bears, especially those without established territories, can display unpredictable aggression. We've seen it before." The discussion continued, clinical and evidence-based, professionals working to distill tragedy into lessons that might prevent future deaths. But beneath the technical analysis ran an undercurrent of disquiet. If Melissa Johnson, Meticulous, prepared, rule-following Melissa Johnson could meet such a fate despite doing everything right. What assurances could they possibly offer to the thousands of visitors who ventured into the backcountry each year? "We need to completely revamp the food storage requirements," said Mendez, redirecting the conversation to actionable items. "The tree-hanging method clearly isn't foolproof, especially with bears like Dummer 42 who've learned to defeat it." Harrison nodded in agreement. "I've been field testing those new bear-resistant food canisters out of Missoula. They're showing promising results, even against the most persistent bears. We should make them mandatory for all overnight backcountry permits. Cost will be an issue," Winters cautioned. "They're running about $80 retail. Not every backpacker can afford that." "Less than a funeral," Blackwood said bluntly. "We can look into rental programs, maybe subsidized purchases for frequent backcountry users." The conversation shifted to campsite placements. Several locations, including the decommissioned site where Melissa had camped, were identified as being too close to wildlife corridors or known bear habitat. A comprehensive review of all designated backcountry sites was proposed, with plans to relocate or permanently close those deemed highest risk. "What about proximity of cooking areas to sleeping sites?" asked Vasquez. Johnson had followed guidelines. On that too, cooking area well separated from her tent, but it didn't help. "Current recommendation is 100 yards, Harrison confirmed. "We could increase that, but at some point, practicality becomes an issue, especially in more confined camping areas." "And solo camping," added Blackwood, his voice heavy. "That's the elephant in the room. Data consistently shows groups are significantly safer than individuals in bear country." A tense silence followed. Solo backcountry travel was deeply embedded in the culture of wilderness recreation, a cherished expression of self-reliance and communion with nature. Restricting it would be politically challenging and philosophically contentious. "I'm not suggesting we ban it outright," Blackwood clarified, reading the room. "But we should at least require a special permit with additional safety briefings for solo travelers and strongly discourage it in high-risk areas during peak bear activity seasons." Winters made a note. "We'll draft language for that." "What else?" "Public education," said Mendez firmly. "We need to update all materials to emphasize that even perfect adherence to guidelines doesn't guarantee safety. The message has been too reassuring. Follow these rules and you'll be fine." Johnson's case proves that's not always true. The group continued working through the afternoon, crafting recommendations that would reshape backcountry management, not just in Grand Teton, but potentially throughout the national park system. By the time the meeting concluded, as darkness fell early over the snow-covered landscape, they had drafted a comprehensive overhaul of bear safety protocols, a document that would come to be known informally among park staff as the Johnson Protocols. 300 miles away in a modest home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Brad Johnson sat at his kitchen table, staring at the small wooden box that contained his cousin's ashes. It had been 3 months since he'd returned from Wyoming without Melissa, 3 months of grief and anger, and questions that had no satisfying answers. The phone call from Superintendent Winters earlier that week had caught him off guard. She had explained about the committee meeting, about the policy changes being implemented in response to Melissa's death. "Your cousin's experience is helping us create safer conditions for future backcountry users," she'd said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes it takes tragedy to reveal the gaps in our systems." Brad had thanked her for the information, but the conversation had left him unsettled. There was something both comforting and painful about Melissa's death being reduced to a case study, a catalyst for institutional change. It acknowledged the significance of her loss, while simultaneously diminishing the unique, irreplaceable person she had been. Tammy had come over that evening with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic ear. They'd talked for hours, reminiscing about Melissa, her laugh, her stubbornness, her infectious enthusiasm for life's adventures. They had shed tears and shared memories, working together to ensure that in their hearts at least, Melissa would never be just the Johnson incident. "I still can't believe she's gone," Tammy had said, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes I find myself wanting to call her, to tell her about something I saw or read, and then I remember that Brad understood completely. The absence of Melissa had created a Melissa-shaped hole in his life, a negative space that somehow contained all the vibrant energy and determined spirit that had defined her. In quiet moments, he could almost hear her voice, pragmatic, slightly sardonic, always passionate about whatever had captured her interest. Now, as he sat alone with his thoughts and the small box that contained all that remained of his cousin, Brad found himself reflecting on the park superintendent's words. "Gaps in our systems," she had said. But what system could possibly account for the random cruelty of nature, the unpredictable behavior of a wild animal, the terrible coincidence of Melissa being in exactly the wrong place at the wrong time? The bear responsible for Melissa's death had been located and euthanized within days of the attack. DNA testing had confirmed it was a young male, tagged and known to park rangers as Bear 42, with a history of nuisance behavior around the Pine Ridge area. The park biologist had explained that the bear had likely been orphaned before learning proper foraging skills from its mother, causing it to seek out human food sources instead. It had been relocated twice after getting into campgrounds, but had returned each time, its behavior growing increasingly bold and habituated to human presence. In a way, the biologist had said during their conference call with Brad, both Melissa and the bear were victims of a larger issue, the shrinking buffer between human recreation areas and wild habitat, and our inconsistent management of problem bears before they become truly dangerous. Brad had found this philosophical approach difficult to accept at the time, raw as he was with grief. But as the weeks passed, he'd come to see a certain truth in it. Melissa had died not because she made mistakes or because the bear was malevolent, but because wilderness by its very nature could never be made completely safe. The most carefully designed protocols, the most meticulous preparation, could reduce risks but never eliminate them entirely. This realization had led Brad to an unexpected decision. When the Interagency Bear Management Committee had reached out, seeking input from Melissa's family about proposed policy changes, he had engaged deeply with the process, reading research papers on bear behavior and studying statistics on backcountry incidents. His engineering background gave him a natural affinity for systems thinking, for identifying failure points and designing solutions. Working with the committee, he had helped develop specifications for improved food storage containers and advocated for a more nuanced approach to solo hiking regulations, one that acknowledged both the risks and the deeply personal value many people found in solitary wilderness experiences. Melissa, he knew, would have hated to see solo hiking banned outright because of what happened to her. She would want people to still go, he had told the committee. But she would want them to go with their eyes fully open to the risks, not just following rules with blind faith that they'll be protected. The result was a permit system that required additional training for solo hikers and encouraged, but did not mandate traveling in groups of 2 or more. Brad had also suggested improvements to the safety brochures, replacing reassuring platitudes with frank assessments of risk and clear explanations of the limitations of each safety measure. A memorial fund established in Melissa's name had raised enough money to subsidize bear-resistant food canisters for backcountry users who couldn't afford to purchase them, a program that would be implemented at Grand Teton the following spring. Brad had insisted the canisters be emblazoned not with Melissa's name but with a simple message: adventure wisely, respect the wild. The Monday after Superintendent Winter's call, Brad received a package from the Park Service. Inside was a framed certificate acknowledging Melissa Johnson's contribution to backcountry safety reform, along with a small bronze plaque identical to the one now installed at a viewpoint near where she had camped on her final night. Brad ran his fingers over the embossed letters, feeling both the weight of his loss and a curious sense of completion. Melissa had gone into the wilderness seeking adventure and self-affirmation. She had found both, though not in the way anyone could have anticipated or wished. In the months following her death, as Brad had immersed himself in the work of bear management policy and wilderness safety reform, he had discovered something unexpected: a community of people dedicated to the same balancing act that had defined Melissa's final adventure, finding ways for humans to experience the transformative power of wild places while respecting the inherent risks and unpredictability of nature on its own terms. Through this work, Brad had found a way to honor Melissa that felt authentic to who she had been, a woman who faced challenges directly, who believed in taking calculated risks in pursuit of meaningful experiences, who walked through the world with her eyes open to both its beauty and its dangers. The park officials had told him that since implementing the new protocols, backcountry permit applications had actually increased, not decreased. People still wanted to venture into the wilderness, still sought the solitude and adventure that Melissa had cherished, but they were doing so with better equipment, better information, and a deeper understanding of their place in the natural order. Brad carefully placed the plaque on his mantel, next to a framed photo of Melissa standing triumphant at the summit of a small mountain in Colorado, her arms raised, her face alight with accomplishment and joy. In the picture, she looked exactly as she had always been in life, a woman determined to experience the world on her own terms, regardless of the limitations others tried to impose on her because of her size or gender or anything else. "You're still making a difference, Mel," he said softly to the photograph, "just like you always wanted to." Outside his window, the first snowfall of the winter had begun, delicate flakes spiraling down from a darkening sky, a reminder of the seasons turning, of life continuing its cycle of renewal and change, of the wild heart of the world beating on as it always had and always would, heedless of human attempts to understand or control it. In that moment, Brad felt closer to his cousin than he had since losing her, connected by a shared appreciation for the awesome, implacable power of nature, a power that demanded respect rather than fear, that invited exploration while exacting occasional terrible costs from those who accepted its invitation. It was, he realized, precisely what Melissa had gone seeking in those remote woods of Wyoming, not an absence of danger, but a vital presence of something larger than herself, something that offered perspective on what it meant to be human in a world that existed long before humanity and would continue long after. She had found it, though the price had been greater than anyone could have imagined. As darkness fell over Tulsa, Brad poured himself a small measure of whiskey and raised it in silent toast to his cousin, to her courage, her determination, and the legacy of safer wilderness practices that would bear the invisible imprint of her story for years to come.